but I was instrumental in getting our speaker tonight. I wanted to do something because it's 30 years ago that the state of Connecticut took this John Mason statue out of Mystic, and I thought it's a good time to revisit a very controversial person, John Mason. Even though he is controversial, he's a really big, important part of Mystic's history. And so I thought it was a good time to do it. And we have, when they took the statue away, the state of Connecticut gave the Mystic River Historical Society the plaque that had been on it. And it's at the back. We have it. It's very heavy, and it was not easy to get here, but it's here. So I hope when you leave that you take the time to look at the plaque that was on the statue. And the statue, for those of us who grew up in Mystic, and the statue was always very important to me. I lived in the neighborhood where it was and everything. And I actually was working for the Westerly Sun when they took the statue away. I covered the whole controversy when it was going on. And the day that the statue was taken away, I got a call from somebody in the neighborhood saying, "Hey, the state's here, they're taking the statue away." So the photographer and I jumped in a car, drove over from Westerly. By the time we got here, John Mason was strapped onto a flatbed truck, and they had moved the base off of where it had been sitting. And underneath it were lots of little rocks that the base had been sitting on. I said, I'm going to take one of those rocks as a souvenir. And here it is. It's been sitting in covered in my house for 30 years, and it sat under the John Mason statue for 106 years before that. And I'm the only person who would know that it's anything other than just a rock. But anyway, that's that. So I'm very happy to have Dr. David Naumec with us tonight. He's a historian, an archaeologist, and a museum consultant. And he's worked with Kevin McBride on the various things that have been going on around the Pequot Woods. And the title of his lecture is The Pequot War and Connecticut's Captain Mason. And so give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Testing. It's great to be here. I think this is the first time I've actually given a lecture to the Mystic River Historical Society. Although I've worked in the archives over the years, I see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd. And I'll be moving around. I'll be projecting as best as I can. And yeah, you have me for about an hour. So for better or worse, hopefully nobody falls asleep. But there's going to be a great amount of detail looking at both John Mason's life, the history of the Pequot War in particular, and a bit into the many statues and the development of the statue that Marilyn was discussing. This grows out of, as you'll be seeing shortly, many years of research with Dr. Kevin McBride that stemmed out of work at the Nantucket Pequot Museum, and also most recently stemmed out of an article in Connecticut Explored, great magazine general here of Connecticut history. Check it out. Kathy Hermes, my colleague at Central Connecticut State University at the time, was putting together this issue about commemoration and historical memory in Connecticut. And of course, I feel that conversation is lacking without discussion of the John Mason statue. I wrote an introduction to a larger article in which several other writers gave their perspective, ranging from the chairman of Nantucket and Eastern Pequot, professor from Central Connecticut State University, onwards and so forth. So I'll just get things moving. As soon as the issue was out in print, I felt like the day later, Marilyn got a hold of me and said, "You have to do an article. You have to come give a talk." And it's been a while in the making. I'm glad I can be here. So again, thanks. And it's also an honor and a privilege to be speaking on this topic here in the Pequot homeland, and also not far from where one of the major events of the story took place, right up on Pequot Hill, right? So in any case, what this work stems out of is beginning back in about 2007, and many of you probably remember some of this. It's been in the news. You probably saw us archaeologists poking around in the yards and in Pequot Woods and all over the place here in town. And this program still exists, and hopefully will continue to in the future, even with the rate of government cutbacks. This program is funded by the National Park Service, but is different than most programs because it is funded directly by congressional mandate. And over the years, it's always been increased in funding. It was geared initially for American Civil War and Revolutionary War battlefields, largely in the South. And at one point, the Mashantucket Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Kathleen Knowles, came to Dr. McBride, Director of Research at the time, and said, would a study of the Pequot War qualify, or the Mystic Massacre? And he applied for the grant, and it did. It was one of the first battlefields in the Northeast to receive one of these grants, and definitely the first 17th century battlefield program. So it's there to not only protect endangered and study endangered battlefields, and as you'll see, much of this battlefield is here in the town of Mystic, and actually a lot of it is preserved by a variety of different Groton sort of open space initiatives. I mean, this town is really good at preserving its open space, and by default, or whether they knew it or not, they preserve large portions of this battlefield. But in any case, it's not a story about the battlefield, it's a story about John Mason's role in the Pequot War, which I think is misunderstood by many. And also, in any case, so the Battlefield Project funded several studies of the Pequot War. Beginning in 2007, what we termed, we being Dr. Kevin McBride, my Mashantucket colleagues, myself, the Battle of Mystic Fort. And subsequently, we studied the combat that took place after Mystic Fort. Most people don't really pay much attention to the hours of fighting over several miles as the English and their allied forces had to fight their way back to their ships over in New London Harbor. And that was a nail-biter, wondering if there'd be any artifacts, and lo and behold, there was more artifacts on that 4 miles of battlefield than we ever expected, and we'll talk about that. Siege and Battle of Saybrook Fort. Saybrook got in on the National Park Service program as well, and that's the first time our Captain Mason actually appears for our purposes in the Pequot War, and we'll see how that works out. And the Battle of Metacomic Swamp, known as the Pequot Swamp Fight, if you're from Fairfield or Southport, the last battle of the war. It was a massive war that took place over hundreds of miles, 3 states today, involved thousands of combatants. Here we are. I should have had this up at the time. So here we are with the Mystic Fort project, what we described as the withdrawal from Mystic Fort. There's Saybrook, the last battle of the war down here in Southport, when we discuss the aftermath and Sassacus and his colleagues, his bodyguard actually trying to make it to the Hudson. The last real part of the war is over in New York, in Dover Plains of all places. The war begins on Block Island. This spans quite a bit of space and time. But with every community, Mystic's no different, Saybrook's no different, Southport, the focus, rightfully so and clearly, is on your community, and often the before and after of the conflict is kind of takes second stage, right? So we always want to, when I say me, myself, Dr. McBride, who I still work with very closely, I just came from another battlefield project we're working on, this time the American Revolution in Ridgefield, Connecticut, the other end of the state. When the British attacked Danbury on the way back in 1777, they fought through Ridgefield. So myself and Kevin, we're still plugging away, but learned our methods on these various battlefields. Here we are with the Mystic Fort campaign, but as you'll see here, I mean, it spans from late 1636. Major fighting is really over in late 37, and for our purposes, the Treaty of Hartford is pretty much the terminal end of this war. So it's long and drawn out, but the turning point really takes place here in Mystic. So without getting in too much detail, but it's inevitable, I want to provide some historical background for those of us that aren't, this might be relatively new. I'm sure for most of us in the room, you probably know nearly as much as I do about the topic. But, let's think about what's going on in Connecticut. I mean, if anything, this is for me, and if you can't read it, I'll be discussing point by point, getting through things quickly. But the story begins with the arrival of the Europeans, right? Indigenous people, Pequot, community have lived here in the Northeast since, time immemorial. And this is the Pequot homeland. basically the islands, Fisher Island and even Plum Island, and everything towards Misquamicut, all the way towards the Pequot River or Thames River today, up north to about Patchogue. That, historically, traditionally, was the main homeland. And we'll talk about the ebb and flow of alliances and territories. But one can argue the Spanish were probably the earliest on the scene around here, doing some sort of trading, maybe stopping for fresh water for heading back off to Europe. But for all intents and purposes, or at least the beginning of the historic record oral tradition with Pequot community, the archaeological record, we start with the Dutch. And Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch, showing up about 1608, so about 1609 after. Additional Dutch voyages are taking place, and eventually for the Dutch West India Company. And the Dutch are businessmen, and they're looking for marketable trade items, basically. They're not looking to have a large colonial foothold, to build a ton of fortifications or large towns or anything like that. For them, it's to show up, trade, go back to Europe, roll a profit, come back, repeat the process. That simple act of trading regularly with indigenous people is enough for them to, and to really map the area. Dutch map, scenes from a Dutch map. That's how the Dutch lay claim to land. The English do it a different way, as we know, in the Connecticut River with colonizing with towns. The Dutch are trading. And inevitably, especially with 1614 and Adrian Block, that's usually the point where most historians really believe that probably trade occurred on a regular basis, contact, interaction occurred on a regular basis, when Block, and I'm sure it happened before him, ventured into Long Island Sound, explored up or sailed up the Connecticut River, probably as far as more or less Windsor Locks today, and started mapping the area. Went out towards Narragansett Bay, learned about the people. He had his own interpreters, probably Lenape people or Mohegan people helping him along and translating. But he met the Pequot then. He met the Narragansett, Wampanoags, most likely. And what were the Dutch looking for? Again, trade items. What was valuable? The fur trade, as we know. And as the Dutch found out pretty quick, they're pretty astute business people trying to figure out how to make the most profit. One way you make profit is to learn about the people you're trading with. One way to build a good economic relationship is to avoid war and conflict. That was actually built into the Dutch West India Company charter, to just do not start wars with the wild men as they call them, for native peoples. And ultimately, what's the best mode of exchange? And they learned pretty quickly about the whole sort of wampum economy in the greater Northeast. And most of us probably are familiar with wampum, right? And we're in wampum central. The mint of the wampum trade, as the Dutch called it, was Long Island Sound. The best shell and the best, tradesmen, worksmen, craftsmen that could develop that shell into those small tubular beads. I should have brought some examples that have to be drilled, again, with stone tools and eventually metal when they become available biconically. Once you break those things, it's over with. If you have any other shape than that prescribed small tubular piece of wampum, it doesn't have the same cultural significance and value. And still to this day, it's probably not fully understood the full significance of wampum, but it was involved before Europeans and after Europeans and well into the 1700s for all sorts of daily acts of daily life, from dressing oneself to births, deaths, and marriages to peace and diplomacy and conflict. Everything involved wampum, at least in the Northeast. And if you want it came out of Long Island Sound and probably as far, and it's getting not as good into New York. You can get it up towards the Cape and Narragansett Bay, but the best is around Long Island. The Dutch realized that, and pretty quickly they are trading regularly with the Pequot and others along the shoreline. Now, for perspective, 1620 now, Plymouth Colony is in the works, being settled up north, Plymouth Rock, Pilgrims, the whole 9 yard. There's now English on the scene. The Dutch have been here regularly. They haven't fully colonized, but they have trading posts. They have small settlements. They have all sorts of intermediaries with native peoples. It's a pretty good business that the Dutch are engaging in, but now there's the English on the scene to the north. Of course, there's always been English to the south in Jamestown too, right? So the Plymouth, as we know, colony, the English, they have an alliance with the Wampanoag. This is going to correspond pretty quickly, though, with the fur trade, with the Dutch allying themselves with the Pequot. In 1624, there's a formal trade agreement between the Dutch West India Company and the Pequot, the main sachem at the time. It may not have been Tattobam, it could have been someone before him who was in power, but the agreement was that the Dutch would come here to Mystic, go to the Thames River, probably head out to Fisher's Island, wherever the big communities are, take their ships, load up as much wampum as possible, so that means they're going to trade whatever is being demanded. This puts the Pequot and other wampum producers in such a strong position, right? They can pretty much demand whatever they want. The best iron goods, the best cloth, firearms, powder shot, you name it, the Dutch have to bring it. The Dutch will bring it because they want wampum. They take the wampum upriver where they can really trade it with the Mohawk and others, the Iroquois, for really some of the best furs in the region, the most valuable furs. Take that back to Europe. That's going to fuel this Dutch economy, this Dutch Pequot fur wampum economy, which is pretty amazing. So with that said, that also corresponds, maybe coincidentally or not, with the formation formally of Dutch New Netherlands, of a true colony focused on Manhattan Island and New Amsterdam, there, New York today, upriver, Fort Orange, which Albany today, and other developments along the Hudson. But it's also, I think, a response to now the English to the north, and more English are going to be coming. So in any case, there will also, not to get too far ahead, this will also result in the Dutch being the first Europeans here in the Connecticut region, semi-permanently in a colonial fashion. But when they established a trading post at present-day Hartford, the House de Good Hope, or Hoop, Hoop, or as they call it, I guess. Pardon my Dutch. So in any case, 1630, Massachusetts Bay Colony. Thousands of English are starting to come into this sort of northern region of the Northeast. They're generally trading and keeping their activities around the Cape Cod. The fish is really just as valuable as maybe silver in some areas. The fish is really, pushing that economy. They're trading with groups to the north, but they haven't really learned about the wampum quite yet. But the Dutch will teach them, unfortunately. And once the word is out, the English will be looking for the source of the wampum. It'll draw them to the Connecticut River. It'll draw them to, Long Island Sound. So in any case, we're getting to a little bit about Mason shortly and getting into the Pequot War. But with more Europeans comes more interaction with indigenous communities and more chances of sickness getting passed along. These virgin soil epidemics, as they call them, these diseases that native communities have no natural immunity for. They had never experienced smallpox, the flu, Black Death, all kinds of stuff in Europe that Europeans, Asians, Africans have built up European immunities to over the years. And the fatality rate was incredible by European accounts. So in any case, imagine what that does when we've experienced some major epidemics in recent years, but nothing like a 80% mortality rate, 75% at best, 90 at times. Entire villages being destroyed. And what does that do when your young and old are dying? Your leaders, your religious leaders, your tool makers, your knowledge keepers, right? And at a time where you're wondering if these newcomers have a more powerful sort of God than you. I mean, imagine what that even means culturally, kind of stuff. So it's just you can't underestimate or I suppose, the impact of these epidemics. Now, with the Dutch on the Connecticut River, and with this agreement with the Pequot, I think there was some misunderstanding. I think the Dutch believe it's going to be an open, free trade zone now in the Connecticut River. The Pequot, who have been expanding their confederacy, let's say, now that they are trying to control wampum producing areas, the Pequots between 1620 and 1630 at the time, about the time when they also give permission to build a trading house on up at Hartford. They've been expanding in areas that produce wampum along the shoreline. They bring other communities under, I guess we would call it, like in a Western sense, like their kind of political domain. It's a tributary relationship, as was known in kind of Algonquin country. That is, there was a more powerful group, the Pequot, that had a relationship with these lower groups that were, had to annually and probably on a regular basis provide evidence of their fidelity to the Pequots in tribute. Food, food supplies, probably wampum, the shoreline ones. Having warriors committed at times of conflict onwards and so forth. So all the way towards, basically, we'll see in a minute, present-day Greenwich, all the way east towards more or less Misquamicut for a while, eastern Long Island, and then eventually north into the Connecticut River to even maintain some control over the early fur trade. The Pequot were very strategic on where they were trying to bring other groups into their kind of domain. It can be done through marriage, it can be done willingly, it can be done through war. In late, in early 30, probably 1630, 31, 32, the Dutch comment that the Pequot and the Connecticut River Indians, probably the Wangunk and the Sequoian, met on the field of battle 3 times with all their men, like mass forces, probably several hundred on each side, maybe up to 1,000 each. I mean, the Pequot could definitely wield up to about 1,000, raised 1,000 troops at this time. And the Dutch said they fought 3 times, and the River Indians were defeated 3 times, and thus became subjects of the Pequot. So for that, region of Connecticut, that was done through military force. The shoreline, it was probably more political, like negotiations. So this is a growing confederacy, as we call it. The Dutch and Pequot have a small fight over the House of Hope and access to it. It's not quite understood how it happens, but I think the takeaway here and what's important to our story and our study of the Pequot War is that the Pequot for the first time really fought Europeans, Dutch Marines from New Netherlands that were sent up to defend the fort. Probably normally had like a garrison of 6 people, like 60 were sent up to fight the Pequot. And they probably brought up about 1,000 troops in big formations of battle like they did against the Wangunk, but then they learned, that wasn't as effective against musket fire, right, and firearms. So I think the Pequot experience fighting the Dutch really briefly. They patched it up like within a year, but things that happened during that war had great ramifications, as we'll talk about. During that time, the Pequot learned how to fight Europeans. Don't do it in massive formations. Fight in smaller companies, smaller groups, as we'll talk about, and we'll get more into that. Now, also, what was really important that happened during this time was the death of Captain Stone. He was a notorious trader, I guess you'd call him, merchant from all over the place, but he's kind of like associated with the Virginians. He was up in Boston, basically kicked out for various reasons, and was on the Connecticut River, took some probably Nahantic Indians hostage for pilots to get him upriver, and in the course they were attacked and liberated by their kinsmen. Captain Stone was killed, the ship was sunk. That was, at the time, nobody was really shedding a tear over Captain Stone, but as time went on and as events keep piling on, the English will later use the death of Stone as one of their reasons for moving into the region, basically, and also Massachusetts starting war with the Pequot. So the English are pulled in the Connecticut River, as you know, for a lot of reasons, but mainly it's because back to the Pequot expanding on the Connecticut River through military force, remember? That happened about 1630-ish. It only took a few years for some of those sachems in the river to search for ways to become free again or independent. So they're sending emissaries up to Boston, up to Plymouth, inviting the English to, hey, come settle among us on the Connecticut River and, trade with us and protect us from the Pequot, basically. Massachusetts Bay doesn't take them up in the offer because they know how, what a powder keg it is there and how, how many different claims there are to the river. Plymouth at first is hesitant, but when the Dutch build a trading post, the House of Hope, on the river, it basically is the point where Plymouth and Boston start to send their own people on the river because they don't want to lose it completely. Well, they don't even have any real right to it, but they want to have access to it and to not be cut off by Dutch domination of the river. To the Dutch, this is Eastern New Netherlands. Let me say that. Where we're sitting right now, you're in the colony of Eastern New Netherlands. If this was 1624, 5, 30, certainly 33, on the eve of the Pequot War, the Dutch are claiming this land and are becoming increasingly upset when they see more English pouring into the valley. Windsor, they, where the story goes, right, the early traders there are on one boat. They sail right by the guns of the House of Hope. The Dutch don't open fire. The Dutch aren't going to attack the English. The English aren't going to attack the Dutch. They're allies in Europe, Protestant allies. They've been fighting together in the 30 Years' War. Doing some real deep research, I found there was like a political incident out in like Indonesia about this time where like a Dutch garrison slaughtered an English trader post and it almost erupted in war. So the last thing you need is something like that happening here. I could never understand how the Dutch and English are like within spitting distance of each other when it comes to settling the river. But the Dutch do a show of force, the English hold their ground, and more colonists come in. So remember, the Dutch are in present-day Hartford. They're cut off at the north by Plymouth at Windsor. To get any furs coming down, the English settled north of the Dutch. Wethersfield is south of the Dutch. They're cut off there. The Dutch are pretty much now kind of hemmed in by these English settlements that happened really quickly, all because of these these conquered tribes are inviting them in. Hartford, we have the overland march by Hooker. There's another colony, and this is something like I want us to leave maybe more confused than ever after this conversation, but it's important that you can't, it's really difficult to talk about the English. It's hard to talk about the Indians when you're talking about dozens of different ethnic communities and like a half dozen different colonies, right? We have Plymouth Colony. We have Massachusetts Bay Colony. The English are nominally linked to both, but are really quickly trying to form their own Connecticut River colony. Saybrook has a colony. They were hoping to settle where these other English are north of them. It was a surprise when Gardner shows up and he's forced to fortify and settle at the mouth of the river at Saybrook Point, right? So there's a lot of people pouring into the region quickly. And for the Pequot, they politically believe or lay domain over everything, tributary status. The Dutch claim everything colonially as Eastern New Netherlands. So it's amazing, I guess it took this long for conflict to happen. The Pequot even send their own, emissaries to Boston to try to settle things out a little bit. Like there's a lot of English showing up, things could happen. They're also looking for new trade ties. They even sought a military alliance with the English in Boston. How different could history have been, perhaps, if this political event went down differently? But the English put down their foot and demanded, now for the first time, the killers of Captain Stone. Like who? Like that guy that you guys kicked out? And tons of wampum, which they understand is very valuable now. And rights to the Connecticut River, to these towns that have been settled. And the Pequots back away. Like, we don't have the authority to do that. We got to go talk to our sachems, talk to you later. And it just kind of fizzled out. But to the English, they sort of, almost took it as like the Pequot agreed to it. It's really strange when you read Winthrop's accounts. And then to cap it all off, and before we look at some other things here, the death of Captain Oldham, one of the traders from, I think he would be from Wethersfield, and he was trading off Block Island. He's found murdered off Block Island, and it was the Block Island Indians, the Manassas that did it. They have no ties to the Pequot. They're not tributaries to the Pequot. But, with this building political tension, Boston used the death of Oldham as also more leverage in these negotiations, blaming the death on the Pequot. They had nothing to do with it. Now, John Mason, how's he fit into all this? And this is going to be, for the Mason descendants, I see in the crowd, forgive me for not being more detailed. But, just to perspective, the man is born about 1600 by all accounts, birth records. From what I gather, and I'm not a Mason expert, let me tell you, but you can't study this topic without having to get into great detail. One thing that we, Dr. McBride, myself, various other historians, tribal colleagues have really come to find out, and probably genealogists already know this, but almost any officer in the colonial context of the Northeast already had military service in Europe. Boy, what a concept. But the 30 Years' War that's been racking Europe, one of the most destructive wars until like World War I, decimated Central Europe. There was several English regiments that served. Mason was among them. Gardner is among them. Captain Underhill we'll hear about. Like every officer, and even lower officers, and even anybody that fought in the war, they were already in the Netherlands usually. Most of the settlers too of Connecticut, the English settlers, certainly the Dutch, were veterans. So it's almost like a soldier-settler kind of colonial thing going on here. A lot of veterans, basically. So he serves in the 30 Years' War, several big sieges, basically comes out as an engineer with he might be a lieutenant when he gets out. Arrives in Mass Bay with many others, Dorchester, 1632, really quickly appointed captain. And you don't just get appointed captain, even if you have political connections, without some military experience, right? So this speaks to also his service real recently over in the Low Country in the Netherlands. Elected to the General Court, so he's also, in high regard by his fellow townspeople, and through that point also is early on the scene for arranging the removal of a number of Dorchester residents to the Connecticut River, and they will head to Windsor because that ties pre-existing with Dorchester. The Plymouth people at Windsor are kind of getting crowded. Eventually they'll sell out and leave, but these towns are becoming populated pretty quickly. So boy, it only takes a few years upon arrival for Mason and others to just get a foothold in Mass, figure things out. A little too crowded. There's these good lands in Connecticut, and they move with their congregation generally to these new towns. Mason's really active in fortifications over in Massachusetts, Castle Island as well, famously. So yeah, so he shows up in 1635, right on the eve of this mess. A year later, he'll be well aware of the death of Captain Oldham. He's probably already interacted with many indigenous people in the region. There's no way you cannot. There's Pequot people, Wangunk people close by. And with that said, here's a map I put together to also just give us a visual, excuse me, of primary sources, historical accounts of groups in the region, kind of where they fall. But what I was concerned with, and I should add to it over the years, more groups we find, are those different various communities that are tributary or tributes to the Pequot by the eve of the war in 1636. And again, for various reasons. Through intermarriage, because it economically makes sense. If you want the best trade goods, you talk to the Pequot. They have a direct connection with the Dutch. Maybe you want military support against the Mohawk that keep coming over the hills and attacking people too. Or you've been conquered, like the Connecticut River towns after 3 major battles in 1630. There's a lot of reasons why this confederacy can grow, but it's centered around one community, the Pequot. The main sachem, now Sassacus, is also supported by dozens of other major villages, that are connected through like kinship ties and all those sachems. It's a pretty strong network, but it's in other places it might not be such a strong connection because through various reasons coming into the Confederacy. Also, look how it coincidentally, not so much, basically follows more or less the shape of what will be colonial Connecticut, state of Connecticut today. I argue, and I think all of us argue, or anybody who's studied the war, basically that the root of Connecticut basically is rooted in the aftermath of the Pequot War, the conquest of the Pequot, the extent of their confederacy at the time of the war. So there's a lot of other groups. This is very simplistic, but I think it also helps demonstrate the breadth of this growing network, which is a result of the Dutch and that demand for wampum, I think you'd argue. This didn't happen until the Dutch arrived. All right, so the war begins. How? Why? Massachusetts is to blame. And this is, I guess, the complications of the whole Pequot War and why you're not going to hear about John Mason for a while. What always kind of struck me is how all these different colonies were they were all competitors of one another. And when the war actually kind of started through the actions of Mass Bay, it all fell onto the English in Connecticut. Massachusetts kind of started the war and left. So Massachusetts Bay under Captain Endicott with 100 soldiers, basically to avenge the death of Captain Stone. Like, really? And the death of Oldham, okay, I understand that, I guess. And to basically, I guess, make a firm claim to Connecticut by trying to force the Pequot into submission, this attack force out of nowhere lands on Block Island to avenge Oldham's death. And their orders are to basically kill all the men. I mean, this is Puritan fashion, just war, I guess, for the, avenging the death of their, fellow countrymen there, Oldham, and to take women and children as hostages and to basically conquer the island. Didn't go too well because the Block Islanders, I'm sure, have been invaded many times before, and probably by other Europeans. I'm sure the Spanish and Portuguese, Iberians tried to sack the island a few times. And they were, really easily hidden in, wetlands, attacked when they could. The English burnt villages, burnt corn, killed dogs, and took off. Then they showed up in Saybrook Fort. Hello, Lion Gardner, we're here to start a war. And he was besides himself. This is Saybrook Colony. This is an army from Massachusetts Bay Colony coming to his backyard, telling him, like, oh, our plan is to land on the Pequot the river, demand a boatload of wampum, the killers of Stone, want the Pequot to submit, and then we'll be gone. And he's like, you're crazy. They're not going to do that. You're going to start a war. And his words, which are famous, are, you've come hither to raise these wasps around my ears, the Pequot, and then you'll just flee back to Massachusetts and basically leave me to, clean up the mess. And that's basically what happened. And he was outranked by Endicott. Endicott didn't care. They sent their armada over to the Thames River, the Pequot River, and landed troops basically on Groton Heights, I guess, more or less. And after being delayed for several hours, they finally went forth and just destroyed the village. Their Massachusetts Indian interpreter, Kashamaquin of all people, tracked down some Pequots in the swamp and killed one or two of them. That doesn't go over too well. I don't think the English really, met much resistance or inflicted many casualties, but they burnt down a village. Next day, they go to the Niantic side, New London, burn down that village. And while stealing corn, they're attacked in force and pretty much take off. And the Saybrook guys have to fight their way out of there. It's a great account. I think if I could, there's not many. There's several really good accounts of the Pequot War that you could get tonight if you start Googling around online, if you look up, the Mason narrative or Gardner or any of them. But I think Lion Gardner's is one of the best that, gives us a lot of insights into the Pequot War. So as soon as Massachusetts takes off, the war begins. And the war is focused on Saybrook. It says a lot about, I think, native culture and military tactics and ways of fighting war. I mean, they could have gone and, flattened soft targets up and down the river, any of these towns. They're not expecting it. They could have done a lot of things, but they focus on a military installation, the only one in the region, Saybrook Fort. I guess they probably noticed the boats, sailing in and out of there that burnt down their villages. Maybe that also caught their attention. But now for, the next 6 months, the first half of this war is fought completely around Saybrook. Massachusetts doesn't care. They left, just like Gardner predicted. Plymouth has no skin in the game. They don't want anything to do with this, as we'll talk about if you can bear with me. Connecticut's kind of upriver biting their fingernails like, we had nothing to do with this. Like, that was Massachusetts. Connecticut, where Mason is living in Windsor. They're not going to be sending any help to Gardner. They're on their own, and they have like a company, 20 soldiers, and a couple women and children, and it's, they're all cooped up in this fort that's barely built. And their cattle and cornfields are several miles away. That's not very good. And they have a blockhouse and warehouses they're supposed to defend. It's untenable position, and Gardner is complaining his entire narrative about this. Like, no one is helping us. We're dying every day. We're getting attacked every day. The Pequot are and it's got to be psychological warfare, are basically mutilating the animals, like, shooting them up with arrows and stuff like that, and, cutting up a little bit. I mean, that's valuable to lose cattle, right? And that's also your food supply. Pretty soon all the, goats and rams and anything that's still living is pushed upriver to Hartford. Warehouses are destroyed, blockhouses. So it's not going good for the English. It's pretty amazing. And Gardner is a trained military veteran of the 30 Years' War, like Mason, like Underhill. And I love Gardner's accounts because he basically keeps, it's first devoid of any religious overtones. He doesn't ever mention God, I think, ever, or province of anything, like many of the other narratives. It's like an account of a veteran, talking about what he saw, the fighting he did, countermeasures he took to fight the Pequot, things he told his troops to do and they didn't listen to him, they all got killed. Like every other page is like, they didn't listen to me and they all died. And it's like, basically it. So point is there, Lyon Gardner is becoming very veteran and astute on Pequot battle tactics. The Pequot are learning a lot too about how veteran soldiers would fight, especially, I guess, in a fortified position. The Pequot knock out a blockhouse. They nearly kill Gardner and all his men in February 22nd when they go out to basically burn down reeds for better kind of fuel the fire and view. They're ambushed by like 60 Pequot, and like about 6 men are killed there. Gardner makes it back with like a half dozen arrows shot in him. But luckily he's wearing a buff coat, heavy body armor that's kind of basically heavy leather, heavy kind of cow's hide. The Pequot thought they killed him. A few weeks later, a body of Pequot come up to the fort and have a parley, as Gardner says it, to basically talk it out. They thought they killed all the garrison practically in February, and they said, "Have you had enough yet? Are you still willing to fight?" And I guess at the time, Thomas Stanton is there, famous Stanton from Pawcatuck, Whit Davis Farm, the Indian interpreter. Who knows what this guy is saying, honestly, right? And, God bless Whit, love the guy, talked to him many times early on, and I would question him about, well, your interpreter, he started an Indian war in Virginia, according to accounts, and then he's up here. But anyway, during this communication with the Pequot, something goes wrong. There's a miscommunication, or maybe a purposeful, maybe Stanton says something, but the Pequot are asking, in, I guess, trade, maybe a pidgin Algonquin English kind of language. Gardner can't, reply, but have you fought enough yet? Stanton says, well, you'll see after this, kind of thing. Okay, well, will you kill women and children? And he said something about like, yeah, you'll find out if we do. And that, I guess, really upset the Pequot. And they, basically said, well, you'll see about this. We'll go up to the river. We'll kill English like mosquitoes, blah, blah, blah. Something happened. And that didn't go well. And shortly after, we'll see, is the attack on Wethersfield. During this entire engagement, siege, it's really a siege. At any time, there's at least probably 20 and upwards to 120 at times Pequot allied troops that are laying siege, attacking the English, attacking them at night with guns. They have firearms that they've captured or they had in trade. And they're also attacking boats as they go up and down river. I suspect they probably burned through most of their gunpowder reserves during the siege. As we'll talk about in Mystic, there's not a lot of evidence of natives with firearms during Mystic Fort. So here's the first time Mason really comes on the scene, but it's in March, about the time of this parley or soon after. The fort's ready to fall. There's probably 6 effective men left. If the Pequot really knew how weak they were, they could have dropped Saybrook Fort pretty easily. And frantic letters are being written to Boston and to Hartford, you have to come and help us. If we lose the fort, we lose the mouth of the river. All the eyes of the Indians are upon us. They're waiting to see what we're going to do here. We got to do something. If you want to hold the river, we have to make a stand. Captain Mason comes down is sent downriver with a small company. I think it shows also already of all the 3 towns he is selected, or maybe he has to volunteer for this duty, but I guess it shows probably his veteran status and trust among the river people, Connecticut River people. I think the company might only be 10 men. I could be wrong, maybe 12, but it's not enough to do much, but enough to reinforce the garrison so it won't immediately fall. Luckily, and Mason writes, soon after, Massachusetts Bay finally sends some additional troops under Captain John Underhill. So finally, the different colonies are coming together after leaving, hanging Gardner out to dry for 4 or 5 months. At least 20 English settlers have been killed in the process. Nobody wants to get involved, or perhaps, become, enemies of the Pequot. And the Pequot are keeping all their attacks at Saybrook. Notice that. They're not going upriver. And Boston is pretty safe at this point. Nothing's happening elsewhere. But the region's pretty paranoid. I think one of the unsung heroes of the siege of Saybrook are the Narragansett, who have allied with Massachusetts. They finally become active about this time. It's probably, just about spring. They, have their, war materials together and this and that, and they invade Pequot country. Gardner says as soon as the Gansets invaded, didn't see Pequots after that. So they, I guess, focused on their eastern frontier where, I guess, the real threats were. Mason heads back up with the Connecticut troops upriver. Underhill and the Massachusetts Bay troops have reinforced Saybrook, and they'll remain there. But as a result of that parley gone wrong, a few days after, maybe a week or two, I think 2 weeks after, in April, I guess it took a little bit to organize, the Pequot put together an attack force of 150 troops in 3 canoes. That's what always gets me. Like, you want to talk about old growth trees, right, that we don't see anymore, that can be hollowed out, dug out canoes to take an attack force of 50 men. And that's also how they project force across Long Island Sound. These are probably ocean-going canoes that can get over to Long Island no time flat. Wethersfield didn't see it coming because Connecticut was never under attack. Part of it has to do is that Wethersfield treated their native neighbors who gave them permission to settle there pretty badly, knocked down their wigwams or weetus and beat up their cornfields and kind of shushed them away. I mean, what were they thinking? So Sequosin, the Wangunk sachem who was disrespected, relied on that tributary status I told you about earlier. And boy, is this a pivotal moment for the English in the river as well. Think about all the eyes of the Indians are upon us. Sequosin goes to Sassacus, more than likely, and says, we'd be happy to return back to you as a tributary if you avenge our wrongs at Wethersfield. And the Pequot made a tactical decision to attack the Connecticut and Wethersfield, hoping that it would probably bring other tribes, back to them, showing how weak the English were, and that you picked the wrong side to ally yourselves with. The Dutch are where it's at, us and the Dutch. So 7 English are killed, 2 are captured. In all honesty, though, only a handful of these English are armed. And if we want to, and I think it's really, it's important to get language down, but I was always told the massacre is when unarmed people are killed, no matter where the heck that happens. There was unarmed people killed here, and so it was a massacre. The first woman ever killed is here as one of the 3 girls resist too much, and she's tomahawked at the water side, basically. So 2 more women are taken captive back to Pequot country. They're paraded around. Pequot, villages, they're probably taken to tributary villages to say, hey, look what we can do. The girls, actually, when they returned to the English, were keeping track of places they went, supposedly. They were, in their head, keeping track about how many guns they saw, how many villages. They were getting valuable intelligence just by being paraded around as like war trophies in a sense too. It's later going to be the Dutch that help redeem those captives. So it's the Dutch are in a kind of a pickle here. This terrifies Connecticut. Connecticut's been out of the war. Massachusetts started it. Saybrook colony is suffering because of it. Connecticut now has got attacked at Wethersfield. There's not a lot of people in the valley. 7, 8, 9, 10, about a dozen people were killed. And that put all of Connecticut into fright. So the General Court orders offensive war against the Pequot. From the Puritan perspective, from the Connecticut perspective, they had nothing to do with the war. And this is now a just war because they had been attacked by an enemy. And now in kind of Puritan mindset, you can go full-fledged offensive war. And actually people that are taken captive in this sort of just war can also be enslaved. And this will be an ongoing thing in kind of the English world for some time. Only 90 soldiers could be drawn out of the 3 towns. And of them, like a quarter of them were elderly, sick, or young kids with probably no combat experience. At least 70, more or less, Indians, quote unquote, join the Connecticut Armed Forces. These will be their Indian allies initially. Uncas and the Mohegans get all the credit, like with almost everything in early Connecticut history. But by all accounts, like Uncas maybe had 20 troops, and all the rest were these tribes that had been conquered, defeated, or just upset at the Pequot. So probably Wangunk and Pequonic and Podunks and who knows, maybe Agawams and who knows what. Like it was a pretty multinational force if you kind of want to think about it that way, multicultural force, I guess. So in any case, they start sailing down to Saybrook Fort, and their battle plan, the orders that they are given by Connecticut, is the exact same orders basically Endicott was trying to follow that set off the war. You know, go into the Pequot harbor, Pequot River, and invade their country and, you know, burn their villages. And, like, I don't think they knew what they were getting into. Gardner certainly didn't think so. Now, before I even get into the Mystic Fort, I almost deleted this because I gave a talk to, like, Colonial War Society not too long ago, and this society, the Mayflower Society, and I just thought this is too interesting to, like, not, you know, delete. So, in any case, Plymouth is trying to stay out of the war. Let me break it down real quick, because, again, we have so many players involved. Winthrop is trying to get Plymouth to go to war against the Pequot. Come on, join us, and we'll conquer the country and, you know, avenge the death of our people. And they're like, we? Our people? Excuse us? Winslow, on the Plymouth side, declared, you know, they're willing to help you, but, you know, we can't really do anything until our court meets in a few months from now. So they're dragging their feet kind of stuff. And then Winslow's like, but, you know, and also, this is also why we're not going to help you, Boston. You didn't help us against the French. You guys are messing with our trade at Kennebec. Connecticut settlers are taking away our lands at Windsor, and, you know, and Mass Bay, you're strong enough to deal with this alone. So it actually really all came out. Like, yeah, our court's not going to meet for a few months, and here's a laundry list of problems we have with you. Again, the English aren't a unified force, right? Every colony has, like, their own agenda. So Plymouth is like, why should we get involved? And Winthrop in Boston goes back, like, we have a common enemy, and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, Plymouth isn't going to have anything to do with it. Eventually, they'll join the war, but Winslow said the war did not concern them. The Pequot didn't kill any of their people. And again, and probably in the Puritan mindset, it's just war. Like, we can't really get involved. They didn't kill our people. They killed your people. Now they killed Saybrook people. Well, now they killed Connecticut people, but not our people. So it's fascinating, the politics, basically. Finally, they'll declare war, like, you know, almost, you know, towards the very end of the war before it's almost over. There's no resolution at this time. So I just keep this in mind. I just think it's interesting, and it was just too good of a slide to get rid of. So in any case, not to belabor us, and I'm probably going to go way over time or not, stop me anytime. As you know, the Connecticut you know, there's an armada of several ships. Some natives are going on foot because they can move faster than the boats, ironically. When they all show up at Saybrook Fort, long story short there, Line Gardner and Captain Underhill from Massachusetts look at the Connecticut Army, and they're like, you guys are nuts. There's no way you're going to be able to take the Pequot. Half your people are sick, old, or young, infirm. Like, there's no way. We've been fighting them for, you know, Gardner's been fighting them for 6 months. He said he said they were better combatants than the Spanish that he was fighting in Europe. Like that, he'd rather fight the Spanish than the Pequot, he writes in his letters. So at any rate, Gardner says, your plan's stupid. We got to do something else. And they formulate a new plan. They send the weakest people back upriver, and they augment them with Underhill's 20 troops from Mass Bay, maybe another dozen or so survivors from Saybrook that are veteran troops at this point. Gardner doesn't go. And you know, once the Reverend, you know, sleeps on it overnight and approves the new plan, they go forth. And basically, the plan Gardner says was, you know, sail in front of Pequot country, make them think you're going back to Boston, just make them think you're retreating, and then go talk to the Narragansetts, who are in the fight and have broken the siege here, and they're allied with Mass, and go, you know, do a plan with them, attack them from the other side. And that's basically what happens. The English go into Narragansett Bay. When the Narragansetts see the English, they also laugh at them, like, you guys are going to get killed. Like, there's no way you're going to kill with 90 people. Actually, at that point, it was exactly 77 troops, infantry. The rest were naval people for the ships. So they're on the ground with 77 troops, and they're going to go against a combatant that can raise 1,000 men. Like, really. So the Narragansetts say, yeah, we'll aid you. Give us a day or two. They bring forth about 200 reinforcements the next day. As they march along basically Route 1 to Ninigret's Fort, where the park is today, the the English actually surround the fort because the Nahantix are so closely related to the Pequot, they thought if one person gets out, they're going to go tell everybody we're here. And the Nahantix are like, oh yeah, we'll join you. They had about 100 people that marched with them as far as the Pawcatuck River, and then they disappeared. They wanted nothing to do with this. The fording place is still there today. It's called Kitchamog. It's just where the bridge is going into Westerly. I haven't broken down what Kitchamog means, but I'm sure it's the waiting place or something to that extent. And they marched overland, and who knows, I mean, the Pequot knew they were coming. They started to get advanced knowledge. I mean, how can you miss like an army of English kind of clanking along? But they knew something's going on out there. And basically the night of the attack, I guess that would be the 25th, the 26th, they camp overnight at Porter's Rocks, as we know, and they can hear Pequots actually singing at Mystic Fort not too far south of them. And actually what they don't know is that 150, I think, reinforcements from other parts of Pequot country arrived at the fort because their plan was the next day to move out towards the Narragansett country and see what was going on. Another crazy what if of history is if Mason's army got a little lost or waited a few more hours, or if the Pequot decided to move out earlier, there would have been no Mystic Fort. There would have been a huge battle in the, in the woods there up in Old Mystic or something like that. It's interesting to think about. But the English moved out relatively quick and stuck to their plan, which was devised ironically, but again, or appropriately by the Narragansett. This is not an English battle plan. I should have stepped back and say that. When Mason was meeting with Miantonomy and Canonicus, the Narragansett suggested, if you want to fight the Pequot, this is how you do it, all right? First off, you better get in there quick and surround their fort. If you're lucky enough to get them in the fort, you got to surround it because they're going to flee. Maybe have a blocking force just beyond the fort because they're going to try to retreat to the swamps, and you can get them there. And if you miss them completely, then you got to hang out for 2 weeks, and then eventually they'll come back to their country. That's just, I guess, native tactics. It's such an interesting insight. Oh yeah, give your guys body armor so you can rush in there and do whatever you want, kill everybody. And yeah, and that was basically what the English did. I'm sure there was some, the incineration of the fort, I'm sure, was not part of the Narragansett plan. Here's, primary accounts by either men that were there, like Mason. Vincent may have been there, or he was getting all his accounts from veterans. He's like the earliest writer of Pequot War accounts. But talking about a typical Algonquin fort with, pretty relatively thick posts that are close enough together to not completely, form a solid wall, but to stop attackers from coming in, and one can shoot out of them with firearms and arrows. There's also a trench along the entire base that throws up dirt to hold the posts in, and also provides almost like breastworks or entrenchments to fight behind, if you think about it. So you're actually looking at the grounds here probably as you're fighting. It's pretty ingenious. And then 2 overlapping entrances that were stuffed with some sort of trees and brush that would the Pequot lay down at night, so it was hard to get in. In any case, the plan was to surround it with English troops, do a second ring with the native allies, which now number up to 300 at this point, and to, as Mason says, I mean, this is his own words, we concluded to destroy them by the sword and save the plunder. So kill the inhabitants, and that's good old 30 Years' War tactics. I mean, that's what these guys have been doing in Europe, during their early military career. To them, this is probably similar to any other fortification or redoubt. And it was European strategy or tactics that not that they ever gave them a chance to surrender, but if the inhabitants or the garrison doesn't surrender, then it's a black flag, no quarter. They kill everybody. I mean, I think that's probably, just standard practice as well. And then what's plunder? I mean, what's valuable at this point? Wampum if you can get it. Probably mats, trade goods. Burning it was plan B. I mean, you burn it, you have no plunder, right? But as the English, got into position, and the Connecticut company under Mason charges in 20 some odd guys, they aren't supported quite yet by Underhill. They rush into a fort that they thought maybe had 50 defenders. There's like 200 defenders now. So by Mason's account, by other English accounts, by Underhill's account, the fact that Underhill takes so long to get into the fort, he's taken heavy fire. It was hard to fight because the streets were so close, the Weetus were so close. it was packed with non-combatants too. I mean, there's old, elderly people, women and children, and warriors. These are fortified villages. They're not forts in the European fashion. It's a community in a fortified area. And in any case, the English take like 50% casualties or better in like 15 minutes. By Underhill's account, everyone, soldiers are being hit in the face and the neck and the arms and the legs and all the areas that are not armored, right? No helmet, no backplate, breastplate. And they're getting overwhelmed really quickly. This is not like the ideal kind of environment for musket fire. I mean, especially the guns these guys are carrying at the time. The bowmen have rapid fire weapons point blank. They're emptying their quivers, like arrows are flying in on target and hitting these English soldiers. Captain Seeley is hit right in the head with an arrow that he mentions was flat. That'll be important when I show you artifacts later. Most of the arrowheads, contrary to popular belief, are all metal. Why wouldn't they be? Once indigenous people start importing and trading for metal goods, they stop making stone tools. Not to mention epidemics probably impact a lot of those tool makers that knew how to do it for years and learned from their grandparents and their family. But metal tools take over. So anyway, metal arrows are flying left and right. The English are overwhelmed, and they have to retreat, and that's when Mason orders firing of the fort. The fort is set on fire, the wind is pushing east to west, and it's driving the flames. And also, these weetus, these wigwams, are constructed in the summer out of reeds. Highly flammable. It's not bark, it's nothing like that. That's winter quarters. This is summer. So these reeds are going to burn pretty quickly, and especially if they're treated with any sort of water repellent, any sort of oils or fats or anything like that. Who knows, right? But it burnt quick. And the English set up a perimeter and start engaging any targets, and they're mainly warriors at this point. As the native peoples are pushed to the southwest corner, the English mass there as well. And there's one forlorn hope where when there's no way, the fires are, I guess, burning too hot. The last of the warriors rush out to try to punch through the English lines to at least let the last of the non-combatants out. And it's just wanton killing, right? The English are killing everybody. It's their strategy. They're shooting their own allies that don't have marks or signifying that, hey, I'm a Narragansett. Bam. There's friendly fire going on. There's also young soldiers that never fought in the 30 Years' War that probably are not accustomed to this kind of slaughter, and they're the ones that are probably a little hesitant to run through like an old woman or a young child. And it's just horror, right? So this is where the massacre takes place. It's a battle, by all accounts. The English are on their heels after charging in. They set up a perimeter, and if it's not for the fire, who knows? If Mason didn't order the burning of the fort, maybe that fort could have held on until reinforcements got on the battlefield. But that tactic learned from probably fighting in Europe and just common sense, and maybe even suggested from the Narragansetts, who knows? I mean, native peoples attacked their own other people's forts, their enemies' forts with incendiary devices. They tried to burn out their enemies too. This is war, right? Unfortunately, this was European total war that Algonquins weren't used to. You don't slaughter everybody. You try to save women and children and elders to bring into your community. Yeah, you want to kill and capture, the warriors, but man, you don't slaughter everybody. I think that was agreed upon years ago. So the English lost several in the battle, but a lot of wounded. If they had 77 troops, they lost about 40 wounded. That's already 50% casualties. So the English are now have to get back to their ships over 8 miles out of Mystic, Pequot Hill, and many people are walking wounded or on stretchers. We don't know how many natives were casualties, but I said friendly fire happened. And the only survivors were like 6 to 8, maybe a dozen women and a few kids that made it through the English lines and were captured by the native second ring, basically. They were brought back to Hartford, where subsequently the English executed a few of the women. So, I mean, it's just like, and that has to do with politics and quarrying, sachems that were fighting over them. It's just, it doesn't end. So in any case, now the battle is over, and the English are kind of ahead of schedule. They're waiting for their ships to come from Narragansett Bay to meet them in New London, and if they march off too quick, they might get cut off. Maybe their ships are, you never know with sailing, right? Their ships might be more than a few hours late, maybe half a day late. So they hold on Mystic Hill as reinforcements start to arrive from other villages, and men and armed men and warriors start to show up to wonder what's going on at Mystic. What's this plume of smoke? Why are there wounded people and missing arms and stuff running, down the hill? And it's just like, what is going on? And they find English soldiers up there, and then the fight begins. So this is what we consider the English, it's a mouthful, the English Allied withdrawal and Pequot counterattacks. Like, how else can we describe it? It's not a retreat. The English don't run for their lives. They do an organized retreat or forward advance. They just start marching towards the harbor where they're going to meet their ships. They don't do it until they actually see their ships, and as soon as it happens, Mason gives the command to start marching. During that time, there must be an hour caring for wounded. Underhill, breaks off to rescue a few native troops that are being attacked by the Pequot. There's a lot happening on the hill, so it's a lot more than just Mystic Fort proper. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff we definitely didn't find up on that hill. So, in any case, keep an eye out in the future, Mystic River Historical Society. And you want to talk about Pequot Woods. You want to talk about the what's it called? The sheep farm. All this Groton open space stuff. You want to do a real fun walk sometime? Have old Professor Naumec give you the battlefield walk through Pequot Woods. It's no joke. Like 1/3 of this battlefield is already preserved. Luckily, happened so before you even started the project in Pequot Woods. Like, it's incredible, like how much of this is actually preserved, but how much of it needs help. And we only had a few sentences to go on. Like, the English don't discuss much after Mystic. Maybe it's for publication reasons, or to them, like, the fight was at Mystic, and this is just 8 miles of nonstop, nondescript skirmishing. There's little hints of it in the different narratives, but we had, myself and Dr. McBride had so little to go on, and got a pretty large grant from the Park Service, and we were really nervous we weren't going to find anything, because they don't talk about it. But lo and behold, the vast majority of artifacts, more artifacts than we've ever found in any Pequot War site, are basically west of Pequot Hill and practically into all the way to Pequot, more or less, the cove.
Where's Pequot Hill?
Pequot Avenue.
Pequot Avenue.
East of it. Can you point it on the map?
That's not going to help you. So here's the highway, here's 95. Here's Pequot, the Mystic Fort, more or less. And, we don't really, some of you probably know more or less where it is, but it's not advertised. There's no commemoration in this town, right? There's no monuments. Speaking of monuments, there's no monuments anymore. There's no historical markers. No one knows where any of these sites are. It's so interesting. All the communities of the Pequot War, Groton does no commemoration in terms of kind of Western sort of stuff. But in any case, it's nonstop fighting. All you're seeing is musket balls, musket balls, musket balls. I don't even know what year we made this map, but we had 3 consecutive grants to keep tracking out this battlefield. We had nothing to go on but artifacts. But there was enough land that we could keep tracking the musket balls and almost figure, up on the hill, there must have been somebody, and we find something up there. And gun parts, boy, broken. I'll show you some stuff. I'll stop talking. And speaking of which, so here's some artifacts. The fighting stops about, by all accounts, 2 miles from the harbor, which is at Pequot, more or less. We haven't tracked it out completely. From there, who knows why, the Pequot were exhausted, their troops took too many casualties, or who knows what, but the fighting stopped about there. And when Mason got back to the harbor, and the ships were there, and they're unloading the wounded, I've never seen a historian catch this. I don't know if anybody even reads closely anymore, except some of us Mason descendants out there. But man, he talks about, oh yeah, when this was all over, I had but 5 men still standing that weren't touched. I was like, my God, nobody ever caught that before? Of 77, there was only 5 that made it out without wounds? I'm no mathematician, it's gonna be 90-some-odd% casualty rate, right? They were really lucky to make it out. How did they make it out? Native allies, by fighting in integrated groups. There's so many broken gun parts out there. They must have been down to a few guns that were still working by the time it was all over. But with 1 English soldier and maybe a half a dozen native bowmen, that's a pretty potent little fire team you have there. You have a musket that can reach out and touch somebody and really, stopping power. Rapid fire weapons on either side of you with bowmen that can just let them fly. And the Pequot and their allies who were fighting, they could not break and overrun these English, even in this English allied force, right? The English wouldn't have made it out there by themselves. their native allies wouldn't have made it out there by themselves. But fighting together under Mason's command in the front and the head of the column, Underhill's command in the back of the column, they made it out of there. And that's also the Rosetta Stone of cracking these narratives. Once you realize Underhill is only describing clearly what he saw, and he's only describing the rear of the fighting. Once you understand Mason's describing what he saw, and the front of the fighting, it helps put things in place. So, in any case. Artifacts, everything's brass, everything's metal, everything's made out of trade items. There was probably Pequot allied forces. We're talking other Mohegans were fighting alongside the Pequot. They were still tributes at the time, allies. Uncas was rogue. He only had a few people, his immediate family members and community, that allied with the English. There was probably Nipmuc peoples there, Nahantic peoples there. Who knows who was in Pequot country at the time? Again, they have many troops to draw from, and they took a beating in this fight. All the arrows are going to be brass, and these here are really interesting. If you can see them, you probably can't, but they're actually bent over. Both of them came out of the entrance that Mason's troops stormed in Mystic Fort in the northeast, and they're bent over because they hit English body armor. Bang, bang. They bounced off helmets, bounced off breastplates. And they bent over exactly as far as the arrow shaft, if you think about it. Conditions were so perfect on the hill. This one that looks blue, if you can even see it, it was under maybe a centimeter or two of soil for the past nearly 400 years, 375 at the time. And it was such a wet environment with no oxygen that when it came out, it still had leather and adhesive on it. Like from when they, so we have evidence now. People speculate, and there's plenty of great oral tradition and indigenous bow makers out there, but we have direct physical evidence of how these bows were arrows were manufactured, at the time. So in any case, and even one of these actually had thread still stuck on it, because anything that comes into contact with brass, generally, probably even copper, copper fights off the microbes that break down organic material, so it preserves organic material, anything close to copper. That includes skin and human remains too, but none of that were found. Interesting, this is a conical point, and what's really interesting about that, it really appears that the only native troops, soldiers, warriors, that had these conical arrow points, very finely made, pretty much armor piercing if you think about it, because it wraps the entire arrow shaft where the other ones are flat and can bend. Only Connecticut River Indians. Probably the Wangunk, probably the Podunk, probably the Pequot, all the Indians that are, part of this attack force. It's pretty amazing. The first one that was ever found was found in a funerary context years ago when the sub base was being built. They must have, impacted part of a Pequot burial ground. But one of these arrow points was embedded in a vertebrae and also in a hip of human remains. So, that's probably during the Pequot expansion phase up in the Connecticut River, and maybe fighting the Wangunk in the 1630s. Anyway, I'm talking too much. There's all kinds of arrow points, right? All kinds of neat stuff. And for the Europeans, tons of gun parts, matchlock, flintlocks, snap-ons. We got evidence of wheel-locks, every firearm you can think of. And it's about the right time period. These settlers are coming from Europe. 30 Years' War has flooded the area with surplus arms. Everyone is told you got to bring a gun with you over here. You're going to need it for a lot of reasons. And here it is. It's shot of various calibers, but this makes this battlefield so much more distinct than others because pretty much probably 99% of the lead shot is English fired. Helps us track the battle. Anywhere that's fired is Pequot positions. They missed and, we found the bullet. Dropped ball shows you where English troops are standing. I have stories, we can go onwards and so forth. Gun parts like ramrod tips, tons of buttons that are really early pewter ones, and believe it or not, tons of folding knives. Everyone's carrying folding knives, and actually jaw harps. Both native and European love those Jews harps, jaw harps that you can play on the common trade item. We find that stuff in the woods. And here's actual artifacts in the Pequot War. Mason sword, bam, 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 from the Lighthouse Museum, still on display. Was on Mason's Island in the hands of descendant to 1914 or so, and when the Historical Society managed to get it in their possession, to preserve. This is Hayden's sword in the Historical Society, which by all accounts, he was Mason's battle buddy when they were in Mystic Fort, and Mason enters a wigwam, native warrior pulls up a bow, Hayden whips around quick with the sword and cuts the bowstring. It happened apparently, and that's the sword that did it. Still survives today. This musket is up in the Colonial Society in Taunton. It's for Plymouth, and Plymouth mobilized very late. This was a soldier that was drafted to fight the Pequots way too late, but that was the musket he was carrying. That thing's like taller than me. Mass Bay and Plymouth loved these long guns for fowling, for shooting birds, and you could also use them, in a pinch for military purposes. Matchlock and up in Plymouth. Plymouth is a fun place to visit. Connecticut Historical Society has Davenport's helmet from New Haven, Hayden's sword. This one is the Lighthouse Museum. War concludes, and the lecture and getting into more Mason stuff. I'm sorry, super probably overtime here. But the Pequots now have no choice but to leave. They were dealt a real fatal blow at Mystic. Out of nowhere, the English appear. They knocked out one of their most highly fortified forts that was reinforced with 150 additional warriors. Then they fight their way 8 miles through Pequot country and inflict another probably 200 to 300 casualties on their attackers. Like, this is something the Pequot cannot recover from quickly. And also their tributaries now are starting to think, oh man, did we back the wrong side now? And they look really weak, and now the English are asking us to, surrender. Like, there's all sorts of decisions to be made. The Pequots decide, their sachems decide, their community decides, we got to leave, we have to vacate. And that's indigenous strategy. Women and children go to Long Island, they go to the islands for safety. Some probably go into the northeast or northwest, I should say. The warriors go into basically Windham County, Connecticut to keep fighting. Some that are related to the Narragansetts decide to surrender to the Narragansett. And a large group under Sassacus start moving along the shoreline to try to get to the Hudson River. By all accounts, they are hoping to probably get to the Mohawk, and for whatever reason. Plymouth finally gets into the war when there's nothing else to lose. And the Quinnipiac campaign is the other major, I think you would call it Siege of Mystic Fort, would be the first of the war. The Mystic Fort campaign and the subsequent massacre that happens during the Battle of Mystic Fort is like the turning point of the war. But nobody even knew it. The English didn't even know what a major victory they had. They thought they were going to be fighting for months or years still, like when you read their writings. But they're chasing down largely Mass Bay. They're like, oh, okay, let's get some skin in the game again. So they send 120 troops down. Mason has 40. And then there's some native allies, a couple Mohegans. The Narragansetts are really upset with the English at this point, and they step out. But a lot of Montauk Indians from Long Island join the fight. They switch sides. Oh, we'll be tributes to you, English, and we didn't like the Pequot anyway, and we'll come join you. And Wyandotte, their sachem, and many, probably a couple hundred Eastern Long Island Indians joined the fight in this campaign. Nobody really knows about that. They land at Quinnipiac. They keep marching in. The Battle of the Pequot Swamp, which is Mutacomic is the Algonquin term. We got that out of a land record. It's interviewing Indians from the region, the Sasquatch Indians. And long story short, Mason is really important for us to understand this because he writes about it in his narrative. The Massachusetts troops have field reports, but it seems to be Mason that was kind of with his company on that day happens to rush a few natives that are, I guess, in a cornfield. And they track them up to Mill Hill in Southport, Connecticut. And from that hill, you can see everything. Long Island, 95 today. And then they, with some Massachusetts troops, started to engage. The whole army came together and surrounded this swamp, which, like I-95 goes through today. If you've ever drove to New York City, you've driven through this battlefield. If you want to see it, just try to find the Pequot Library. That brings up a whole nother discussion of commemoration. But in any case, Mason again says, we saw the wigwams, we surrounded them. And this is interesting because the Pequot basically allowed all or facilitated the surrender of all the women and children. So make sure a massacre didn't happen this time. And then just the men stayed in the swamp to fight. And it's not the first time they had a swamp fight, right? But it's the first time the English did. So basically, it's such a great strategy. Long story short, the English have a siege line. In the beginning of the morning of the 27th, I think, or the 14th, the Pequots hit one part of the line, make all kinds of noise, hit them in force, and they don't back off. And okay, this is where they are. And then all the other English break the positions and surge to that point of the fighting, and then the Pequot turn around and just escape out the back because there's no troops there anymore. It was pretty smart, and it resulted in very minimal casualties. But the Pequot could never get a large armed force together again. Plus, their tributaries are turning on them, especially after the death of Sassacus. Sassacus, the main sachem, with his most important kind of council and a really tough bodyguard of like 20 or more, decided to head north along the Housatonic before this battle went down, and they were intercepted by other native peoples across the New York border, probably by Mohegan Indians. That's so close to Mohegan. Often Uncas and the Mohegans get credit for that too, but Mohegans of the Hudson River probably intercepted Sassacus, who was carrying a ton of wampum, and who he'd probably upset their community way back as they, some of their members were, forced into tributary status over the years. Sassacus is killed. Evidence of his death are circulated into Springfield and into Hartford and then sent up to Boston. They have some hands. It could be anybody's hands, but okay, so this is pretty much good enough for the end of the war. The tributaries start tracking down other Pequot communities, and others that were Pequot allies surrendered to the English or switch sides. As we know, the Hartford Treaty basically divides up those Pequots that had been captured by the English or known surrenderers. There's several versions of this treaty. We always hear about the one where the Pequot can no longer use their name, but that was only written in one of four. What it really does is set up the English as the sachems of the Connecticut River Valley. They take over from the Pequot. They basically consider anybody that was tributary to the Pequot for any reason as conquered peoples and conquered lands, as kind of Puritan mindset. And this is really going to be like the core claim of Connecticut colony up until, to argue for a charter years later, and even well beyond that. Like the Pequot War is the beginning of Connecticut colony, honestly, in their land claims, if you think about it. So Mason's later years, and sorry to finally take this long, and I've talked way too much, I'm sure, and my apologies in advance for not getting into such great detail, because Mason is politically involved, militarily involved, and everything major, in Connecticut political history from here on out. But really quickly, he is like the go-to commander-in-chief of Connecticut forces. And soon after the Hartford Treaty, he's in charge of an operation to break up a Pequot community on the Pawcatuck that had resettled contrary to the Hartford Treaty. That is often discussed as part of the Pequot War, but it's really not. There is a famine that happens in the valley because with this war, there's no planting going on. So he is instrumental in acquiring basically a large corn deal, a trade deal, with apparently the Pequot, probably as far north as Deerfield, who were able to bring, hundreds of loads of corn down under some threat. I mean, it's been controversial because Connecticut's orders were like, pay cash, or basically, use the sword and threaten them, more or less. So who knows how the negotiations went, especially if Stanton was there. But in any case, it saved the whole colony from starvation. And, he's courted by parliamentarians to go join the English Civil War, but like a lot of settlers here, many of them came here to kind of avoid that stuff. So he and others, stayed put, and others chose their sides. He becomes commander of Saybrook Fort when Saybrook turns over its colonial possessions to Connecticut, the fort, its land claims, its charter, its patent kind of stuff. Mason takes over the fort. It's already run down, and the thing burns down. They repair it soon after. He's very famous for being one of the founders of Norwich. He's commissioned major about this time, as far as I can track down. I should have done a little bit more, nailing that down in time and space. He'll be this deputy governor of Connecticut and acting governor while Winthrop is overseas trying to get the the charter finalized, and arguing that victory in the war was enough. And dies in 1672, buried in Norwich town. Drove by that cemetery on the way here. It's an open plot because like these early settlers, it was just like low field stones and not a lot of description. This founder's monument came later, as far as I know. It'd be really interesting to do a study of that cemetery. All the major Norwich founders are there. So again, to kind of wrap it up, and not to, since I spoke a bit too much on the Pequot War, I want to make the point again that Mason got involved in the war when Connecticut finally was attacked. I mean, Mason is not involved in the first third of the war. He's involved, after the Pequot decision to attack Wethersfield. And, his actions at Mystic, probably any of these 30-year war commanders who were in that sort of situation probably would have turned to a similar sort of strategy, sadly. But it was like tried and true in Europe, and they did it here. So talk of a Mason statue begins in '59, probably even earlier, but this shows up in the newspapers. And it's pre-Civil War, and who knows what the form would have taken. But there's a discussion by antiquarians and historians like, these early founders, we should remember them, the actions they took. People are already forgetting what happened up on Pequot Hill, but efforts don't go anywhere. 1870, the Mystic Historical Society finally works to bring in public input, decide on what sort of form of commemoration this should take. It definitely should involve John Mason and the early soldiers that fought here. And the public debate is great. It's Mystic River Press. You'll find a lot of it, even the Connecticut Current. But people are taking both sides even then about, yes, we have to put this monument up and to commemorate Mason. Others, why would we put up a monument to this event? And yes, I love our founding colonial fathers, but do we have to commemorate the massacre? The same sort of discussion that's been going on, even to present day, you'll see rooted in these 1870s newspapers. It's interesting. People are largely thinking the same way, especially think of the time period, right? Post-Civil War, Western expansion, Indian Wars, some really horrific stuff happening out west under the, guise of Western expansion kind of stuff, just genocide, right? So a lot of that probably also gets superimposed on the discussion of Mason. Battle of Little Bighorn is kind of like the tail end of this big public discussion. That fires up all sorts of public sentiment as the 7th Cavalry and Custer is annihilated, as they were trying to wipe out a village of their own over, in Little Bighorn. And you see elements of that, now permeating the discussion. And then the monuments everyone kind of have forgot about until like the past 5 or 10 years. They're the ones that are first put up on the Connecticut Capitol building, that fantastic piece of architecture, just amazing. If you haven't taken some time to just walk around the building and park in the legislative building, it's still just, it amazes me inside and out. But they have all these areas, as you know, for statues of, important individuals in Connecticut history. I think the first woman will be Governor Ella Grasso. She's the first woman up there. So before that, it'll be all Civil War heroes, Rev War heroes, early colonial founders. Mason in full, like almost medieval body armor. But again, it's all artist conception. And what always gets me, and it's finally people are aware of it, is like, I couldn't believe it. I think when I was working at the Pequot Museum, our photographer's like, I just came back from Hartford to shoot the Capitol building. He showed me this, and it says, it's hard to see, but you've probably seen it, Attack on Indian Fort. And it shows like these colonists like coming in and burning wigwams and women and children crying and dog barking. It's like pretty crazy stuff. There's only one attack on an Indian fort that involved the incineration of that fort and a massacre of women and children. They just didn't put Mystic on there, right? That's Mystic Fort on the Capitol building in granite or marble or whatever it is. I don't know. It's just amazing, and I think it could use some interpretation. People are finally noticing, but people will probably forget again soon. And then with Groton Heights, I think this is amazing. When the monument went up, and I wrote about it in the article, and the only reason I brought the article is because I really want to read General Sherman's quote that he gave at the dedication of Groton Heights. I mean, this is a guy overseeing the Indian Wars out west and those battles taking place. And I read this. It's in like the thick book of the Battle of Groton Heights by. I already forgot the names, but you'll see in any library. It's in the tail end, the stuff you don't read. I guess it's worth reading every page, but I think he basically said, let me just get to it. The people of Connecticut should remember, above all things, when you criticize sharply and flippantly the Indian policy of the nation and condemn the Army, that it was you who first set the example for Indian policy now pursued when you drove out the Pequots from those very lands almost 250 years ago. I was like, let me reread that. Did General Tecumseh Sherman just say that? It's like only recorded in that book because one of the local Groton residents was writing down all the speeches that day, not all report. And actually Sherman steps up and says, I don't see any reporters, so I'll make a few comments. But this guy caught the comments. And he looked at Mystic Fort for, I guess, a precedent. It's crazy. So yeah, take that to, your next discussion. In 1887, the Assembly now finally resolves to fund the Mason Monument. It takes a few years. They have all sorts of different designs, and they settle upon this grand brass statue that should basically depict a Puritan founder. Nobody knows what Mason looked like, right? We have descendants to draw from, but we all kind of change over the years. No, there's no images or paintings. It was state funded, essentially. And it stood up on the hill for years and had been subject for protest even in the 19th century. People would go up and yell at it, throw paint at it, vandalize it a bit. I also want to step back. When it was dedicated in 1889, when I was first started this project, and Carol Kimball was still alive, and I got to really speak to Carol, sit down with her, and I'm in my 20s, and it's always that thing like, oh, you got all the time in the world, right? Not when somebody's in their 90s, right? But luckily I got to talk to her, and she was like, oh yeah, when I first showed up, and we actually had a connection because I knew her brother-in-law, apparently. He knew my grandfather where I lived, so small Yankee world, right? And in any case, she said, when I first showed up, old-timers were telling me, and this is like her showing up in the 30s or 20s, 30s, when they did the Mason dedication, people were going around and knocking down the signs or turning them around or screwing up, so when people didn't know how to even get to the hill. I guess some people were taking protests into their own hands even at that time. I was like, that's interesting to think about. So anyway, it stood up there for years and would get annually vandalized and toilet papered and revered, and visitors would come check it out. It generally marked the site of Mystic. It's pretty far off, but what I'm also finding with historical signs and monuments, they're often put up at some of the best places to view them and not necessarily at the actual site. As I'm finding in Ridgefield, I'm metal detecting under a sign the battle has happened here. I'm I can't find anything around here. It can't be in here. So in any case, there is as we all know, by 1992, there is a kind of a grassroots, multi-root effort by a lot of different people to remove the statue, and efforts by others to preserve it. And without getting into the details of it, the argument on one hand is it's offensive to this, and that, and have a statue of this mass murderer, blah, blah, blah. And then the other side is, okay, this went up in 1889. Perhaps we should maybe work on more historical context or build more of the story. And Skip Hayward, the tribal chairman at the time, was you take this down. Paraphrasing stories I hear from multiple people are going to forget. So he was actually voting to keep it. So even within the Pequot community, people taking different sides. Ultimately, I guess the committee deciding what to do with it awarded the statue, or decided to send the statue to Mashantucket, and it was actually going to be a part of their exhibits in their Pequot museum they were building. I think Governor Rowland, recently pardoned, at the time was can't have that, right? Connecticut's still fighting the war, not to mention Connecticut paid for it. I think I learned from Mason descendants there's also language that it has to be cared for because of the state funds that were involved in it and this and that. So for whatever reason, it was decided can't have Mashantucket. That's just a bridge too far. So it made sense. I guess it was negotiated to send it to Windsor, where he originally settled, Palisado Green, really close to his home lot, actually. And that's where it stands today, and there's yet still... It's never going to end. The story of the Mason statue, the story of the Pequot War, and perhaps rightfully so, is going to live on, I think, for many generations beyond us. I hope, a study like this that gets into the absolute nitty-gritty boringness of things helps also show how complicated the whole story is, right? It's not just, Indian savages attacking, peaceful settlers. It's not white, devil Europeans coming in, slaughtering and taking everything. There's a lot of players involved on both sides, and Mystic Fort couldn't happen without major native support, militarily. So with that said, it was out of there. And it's in Windsor where you can see it today, and still is the target of vandalism and this and that. And if anything shows, I guess that in itself is an interesting study. There's enough stuff out there, somebody could write a book about this. The study of the committee alone, if you go, I'm sure there's a copy at the Mystic Library here. It's incredible to read through. So this doesn't do it justice, but there is a lot of still ongoing controversy of Mason and Windsor. Recently, the statues in Hartford, and as usual, it's gone back to probably a committee, and we know when politicians put in committee, there, you'll never hear from it again, and they just hope it goes away. Nobody wants to do anything. Do you know how much it would cost? Also, probably, I don't know. What would you do when it's part of the architecture of the building, right? So many questions. Anyway, I was asked to testify, and I was like, nope, thank you. I'll leave that up to Kevin McBride and Walt Woodward and everybody else. They can all have their 2 cents, and and I'm not, anyway. And so that's that. But before I go, let's talk about other commemoration. You got to check out Southport. You got to check out Fairfield. They think the Pequot tribe is from their town. There's so much oral tradition of Pequot Swamp and Pequot Fight and The early settlers of town were veterans of the battle. Like the oldest house in town was built by one of the settlers. It's really amazing to think about. So they got Pequot Library, the Pequot School, the Pequot Park, Pequot Liquor, and Pequot Pizza, and Pequot Condos. Really, it's really, really interesting. But look at this quote. You would think you'd be in Mystic. If one was brought up in local lore, it seems as if the Great Pequot Swamp Fight may have taken in rounds one cradle. The oral tradition is really, so again, it's so interesting, the Pequot War. Different perspective if you're in Mystic, if you're in Saybrook, if you're in Southport, if you're in Wethersfield. There's actually monuments up there. 2 monuments in Southport to the swamp fight and to the Puritan soldiers and ancestors. And you come here to Mystic, nobody would know where Mystic Fort was. There's a monkey tree. I don't even know what a monkey tree is, right? I'm not saying everything should be commemorated, but I just think it's interesting and ironic and maybe telling that other than local knowledge, there's no way to even know. I mean, people have moved into the Pequot Hill neighborhood and they have no idea they're on top of a battlefield site or a massacre site. It's really interesting to think about. So that's where I'm going to end it. I'm sure I'm like 2 hours over. And if there's time to chat, that's great. Otherwise, I'm happy to hang out over refreshments. And there we go. Thank you. Thank you.
If you want to take a few questions?
Happy to take any questions. Yeah. All right, I guess we have time. And anybody, if you want to leave, I won't take it personally. Yes.
My question was, I remember my mother said that Mason's Island was a grant to Mason from the king. Is that true?
Great question about Mason's Island. It was a land grant from the colony of Connecticut, among others, for Mason for his military service in the Pequot War. Yeah, there's truth to that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Questions? All good? Oh, yes. One more.
Did
Yeah.
you find any burial sites?
Any human remains burial sites? No. There's local knowledge of where they may or may not be. We never got that far. We've never encountered human remains on any of these battlefields. People were probably buried far away from this, and any remains in the ground would not last. The soil's so acidic, even though we have some. It's tough out here in New England. Good question, though. Yeah. Yeah.
If you were to have any commemoration of this event, where would you recommend it be?
Well, that's up to each community. So the question is, where would you commemorate this if you're going to commemorate it? Do you really want it on site and have sightseers like Google, just like stare at private houses? Is it better to have it maybe in the center of Mystic to say this happened here to like 1 million tourists that come by and not, to promote historical tourism but not pinpoint the area? There's so many ways of thinking about it. I've worked with a lot of signage recently. And it takes a lot of people involved, I think. Yeah. Not for me to say, it's for the community to think about, I'd say.
But, got one in the back there? Explain to everyone what wampum is, what it's made of, why it's so valuable besides an Indian furniture.
Yeah, question real quick about wampum, and that can be complicated, but it's purple and white shell beads, the quahog and whelk. And the best of it's along the shoreline. And it's really labor intensive. I've seen it handmade by a Pequot craftsman, and it's just amazing how long it takes without metal tools. It has to be a tubular, very small, drilled on either end to be strung on a string. If it looks any different, it doesn't hold the same value, quote unquote. And what is the value? It's hard to say. It's when children are born, wampum's presented. When there's death, there's wampum. When there's war and peace, there's wampum. When there's, who knows, every sort of gathering politically, wampum, right? It's just like, but the Dutch saw it though, they just understood the value that we just said. With wampum, I can get almost any fur, and that's basically it. So with the wampum, it gave them access to the best fur that guns couldn't buy, that textiles couldn't buy, that tools couldn't buy. The whole fur trade is based on, native culture, if you think about it. From wampum to the fur itself. You don't need a firearm to get a beaver, right? but it makes it easier, I guess. So, yeah.
Just a side note, on June 12th of next week, the Mystic Museum of Art is opening an exhibition in conjunction and collaboration with the Pequot Museum. And much of that discussion is based on the wampum.
I'd like to see that. I was, so June 12th was that?
It opens June 12th.
June 12th, yeah. There should be a lot of wampum art, and one of my colleagues at the museum mentioned it, and I hope to go there as well. So thanks for the reminder. Yeah, you want to see more about wampum and contemporary art, check out the museum, June 12th. Art Museum. Okay, thanks.
I'm going to end it here. If there's more questions, perhaps afterwards, but one last thing. Thank you very much. Excellent.
Thank you.
And that's for you. And actually, Marilyn edited this. This was her 25th
Thank you.
anniversary years ago.
I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thanks.